Welcome! In this series of short videos, we will give an introduction to those who have never used PowerBasic before or even considered taking up programming. Today we will look at creating forms with the PowerBasic Windows compiler. There are three products in the PowerBasic family. The console compiler, which we have used in this set of introduction videos to illustrate variables, arrays, subroutines and functions, the Windows compiler, and PB Forms Designer. The console compiler works in the Windows console and is ideal for back-end applications, file processing, or anything that involves minimal user direct interaction. The Windows compiler and the Forms Designer work together to extend your applications to use many user-facing Windows controls and to create forms. Although you can create forms without the Form Designer, using it does save you a lot of time, and as a beginner to PowerBasic, or programming in general, it is a great learning tool. The programming code we have been looking at up until now has been very linear. Each action is followed by another action in a straight path. Even if we start to add conditional code to step over one routine, it's still a straight line through the code, with the second action not commencing until the first has completed. We are about to move into an environment where there can be several things happening at once. And while this can initially sound daunting, PowerBasic can assist you. Welcome to the world of Windows programming and form design. Here we are in the PowerBasic Windows compiler. As you will see if you have watched the previous videos, the layout of this IDE looks remarkably similar to the console compiler. We have a number of menu items and we have a toolbar. One button on the toolbar which you will find exceptionally useful is the last one. This is the Help. When you click on the Help, you will get a reference work for the compiler coming up on your screen. This is very useful if you're not sure of the command to use or you want more details on how the command can be used. As with many things, there are a few different ways of creating forms in Windows. We're going to concentrate on using the dynamic dialog tools, and in particular today we're going to be using the Forms Designer. So to create our new form, let's click on the top left hand corner. This is the icon that allows us to create different types of PowerBasic Windows applications. We're just after a generic PowerBasic program. This gives us the basic structure for our application. What we'll do next is we will save that to the disk, and we'll call our file formdemo.bas. In order to generate our first form, we're going to be using the Forms Designer. In the Tools menu, the PowerBasic Forms appears as the bottom option. The Forms Designer is telling you the file we're using was not created initially by the PowerBasic Forms Designer. But we want to import this file so we can actually make some amendments. And now we're in. Like the other IDE, this also has a toolbar, the first button of which allows us to create a brand new dialog. And here is our dialog on screen. We're going to create a very simple, straightforward dialog with a mere handful of controls. When you're creating your applications, you may well wish a user to log on to your system. So we're going to create a login dialog. The other floating window on the screen are all the different types of controls we can put on our dialog. We'll add some controls in a moment, but let's look at the dialog itself first of all. If we double click on the body of the dialog, a new dialog properties window comes up. This way we can put a title to our dialog. We'll title it Login to the System, and we can give it an ID name. The ID name is the name by which your code will reference this dialog. We'll call it something simple, like Dialog Login. On the tab, we have Styles. This is to designate how you want your dialog to appear. It appears with certain default styles, and the only style we're going to add here is the one down at the bottom here, DS Center. If we tick that box, it tells us the dialog will be centered in the working area of your desktop. This means when your application is executed, the dialog will appear in the center of the screen. This saves you having to work out how large the screen is, or how many screens the user actually has. So if we OK on that, we'll see that the title of the form is now showing Login to System. On our toolbar, there is a Test Dialog button. If we click on that, we'll see exactly how our dialog or our form would appear on the screen. And if we click the Exit Test Mode, it takes us back to our designer. You'll notice when the dialog appeared, it did not have the X at the top right-hand corner of the window, like you would normally have on any normal window. Now for a login, we may not actually need that, but should you actually want that to appear, simply clicking on the dialog itself to get up the styles, and we will put in the sys menu and the captions. If we OK that, you'll see that the X now appears at the top right hand corner, so that when we run a test, we will see that allows us to close the dialog down. So how do we put controls onto the dialog? Well, if this is a standard login screen, you would probably want an entry for the username and an entry for the password. So let's put those on. There are two controls we'd want to do. The first is a label. This is a control used to convey information to the user. If we double click on that, and you'll see a label has now appeared on the dialog. You can move this around to reposition it. And if you double click, like before, you will get the properties coming up. We're going to be using this label purely as a caption for the text box. And if we test our application, there is our piece of text. Now you can enhance it by going into the properties and saying, well, let's not use the standard system color, let's make it blue. And then the text appears in blue. You can change the size of this caption by dragging, or you can double click on it and change the position and size using these units. You'll see there are two sets of units, dialog units and pixels. Since you're designing your application on your own computer, you'll know the size of your own screen. However, when you pass an application to another user, this user could be operating with different screen sizes. They may have a higher or lower resolution on their screen. So to save you the effort of having to calculate the size of a user's screen and move everything around accordingly, you can use dialog units. Dialog units are a useful mechanism by which you are almost screen resolution independent. So that if a user has a screen which is a higher resolution than yours, the dialog will look remarkably similar. So we're going to leave everything in dialog units. So to add an extra box for the other field, we will create another one. And we'll put on this one, enter password. And we'll make that also blue. Now we need our text boxes. This is the next window control along. If we click on that, we can position our text box where we want to have it. You can use the cursor keys to do fine adjustment. And we will double click on that and we will take out the caption. Since the user is going to be keying into this, we want it initially blank. And we will be doing something with the data that goes into this text box, so we'll want to give it a name that means something. This makes your code clearer to read. So we'll call it text username. And we will create another box to hold the password. And we'll call this text password. Now if we try running our application now, we'll see the cursor is currently sitting in the text username, and the password field allows text to be entered. However, standard password fields, you would normally expect the keys pressed by the user to show as asterisks. So to save you having to code this up specially, we can go into the text box, we can have a look at the styles, and you'll find there is a password setting. So if we tick the password setting, which will display an asterisk for each character typed into the control, if we OK that and test once more, we will see that we are no longer getting the actual text the user types when he presses the buttons on the keyboard. So we will now readjust the size of our dialog to fit it in quite nicely. One thing we may want to look at before we leave our Forms Designer is the tab ordering. There is a button on the toolbar called the Tab Order Editor. If you click on that, it will display small yellow numbers against each of the controls on the form. This is to indicate the order which, having pressed the Tab button, Windows would move your cursor through the controls. Of the 4 controls we have on this particular form or dialog, only 2 of them are editable. So when your form loads, it will put the cursor in the first lowest tab number of an editable field. In this case, that will be number 3. If you wish to redo the order of your tabs, you merely, having brought this up, have to click on what you wish to be the first tab and the second tab. The fact that 3 and 4 have been allocated to the 2 label controls at this point in time is irrelevant because the user, while they can in theory tab to them, they cannot enter any text. So if we close this down, and we will save our PowerBasic form, and we'll save it to the same file name. So that's us saved our newly designed form. So if we close our Form Designer and have a look at the code. Now you will see in this formdemo.bas file a large amount of code has been generated. There are lines of code that appear like this, starting #pbforms. These indicate areas of the code that have been generated by PB Forms Designer. You will see your compile, exit and dim all are still there. However, there are a number of includes between these 2 lines of code. PBForms begin includes and PBForms end includes. And you should avoid putting in any code between these 2 lines. If you do, it would possibly confuse the Forms Designer and would certainly be removed by the Forms Designer the next time it's saved. So if you wish to add any of your own includes, put them here below this line of text. You'll also see that a number of constants have been generated by the Forms Designer. Those are the 2 labels, and those are the 2 text controls. It's also generated a constant for the dialog itself. And there is our PB main. It has put in a call to a routine called PBForms initialize com controls, and it's put in a call to show our main dialog. When your application executes, the first routine it will actually execute is the PB main function. And once it has completed the PBForms initialize com controls, it will call the dialog. The call to this function, show dialog login, takes 1 parameter at the moment, and this is the parent of our dialog. The parent in this case is the desktop itself. And after this dialog has been executed, the code will return to the next line. As the next line is to end the PB main function, this would effectively end the application. So what does the show dialog login function actually look like? If we press the F2 button, we can actually see the show dialog login. If we click on that, so in this function, the forms designer has put a fair amount of code. This is the dynamic dialog tools. If you wish to type this text by hand rather than using the form designer, it would work just as well. But it's very quick to use the form designer to generate this code for you. Each of these commands does a different thing. Dialog new would effectively specify the parameters of the dialog. For example, there is our dsCenter command to center the dialog on the screen. And we have 2 lines of code for our text boxes. And we have 2 lines of code for each of the labels and a line of code to set the color of those labels. And like before, we have a PB Forms begin and a PB Forms end to indicate that the lines of code between these 2 lines of text are controlled by the Forms designer. And immediately after that, we have a dialog show command. This will take our prepared dialog and display it on the screen. And at that point in time, that's where things get interesting. One of the parameters for this particular call is this part here. This is calling what is an event handler for our dialog. We have displayed a dialog on screen for the user to click on, and we need to wait for the user to actually do something with the dialog. So we have a brief look at this callback function, this event handler, to see what it does. If we hit the F2 again, we will see here is our callback function, and if we double click on it, this takes us to a special type of function which is prefaced by the word callback. This indicates that this is an event handler for a dialog. And this comes with several different sections. There is an initialization handler, which is a section of code that will be run when the dialog is initially shown. There are a number of other sections which handle things like when the dialog is activated or deactivated. A command section, which is an entry for each of our text boxes. We'll come back to those in a moment. So you can see the form designer is quite capable of generating a fair structure of code that we can build on. The one thing we haven't added to our dialog yet is an OK button. Once the user has keyed in their username and password, you would expect to give them a button to click on to submit their entry. So let's go back to the form designer and add those in. So we go back to the form designer and it displays the dialog as it currently stands. So we make our dialog a little bit bigger, and you will see on our Windows controls there is a button. If we double click on that, it gives us a button. So if we double click on the button, it gives us a caption. So we're going to call that submit, and we have an option for the name. And if we click on the drop down, we will see these are a number of constants either which exist within the application itself or are within PowerBasic. If we just pick the ID OK and hit the OK button on that, and we'll add in a cancel button as well. Now we've clicked on it here and it said it can't move the button to where we wanted to put it, so we'll have it to 00, the top left hand corner, and we'll put in a cancellation button, and we'll just call that exit app, and we'll pick an ID abort one to save us having to name it. So we now have 2 buttons on the form. We have a submit button and we have an exit application button. So if we save that now and close down our form designer and reload the form, if we go back to the login form itself and look down, we'll see we have some entries which have been added. We now have a submit button added and also an abort button. And if we look at the callback function to see what events this has created, you'll see that there are now 2 additional events appearing in our command section. There's one for the OK, which is our submit button, and there's one for the abort, which is our exit button. And for the OK button, it's put in a dialog in command. And for the abort button, it's put in a message box. The message boxes are very useful one line of code to allow you to display information on the screen. So let's try running our application for the first time. If we go up to the toolbar, there are 2 buttons to do this. One to compile the current file, which if we try that to make sure it's going to compile quite cleanly, and the other button will compile and attempt to execute it. So there is our dialog. We have 2 entries, one for the username and one for the password. And if we click on the exit app button, we'll see it's supposed to display a message box, which it does, and the submit button will end the dialog. Ending this dialog would take the code back to the PB main function, and there is no subsequent code after that, so the application should end, which it does. For the purposes of this video, we wish to exit the application when the exit button has been executed. So let's take this line of code and replace this line of code. Now you'll see in the dialog end command there are 2 parameters. One is the handle of the dialog itself, which is derived from this cb.handle, and this extra value here is a number you're passing back to the calling routine. But we're going to pass back ID abort. This allows us to tell the calling application how the dialog was closed. Was it closed on the abort button, or was it closed on the OK button? And we can display that on the screen to the user. If we go back to the PB main function, we'll see that the dialog show command has a parameter which passes the dialog handle, a call to the event handler, the callback function, and it's passing a value to this L result. And L result is what's coming back from our dialog. So since the value is being passed back to this variable, we can perform a test on that. We can test to see if it equals ID OK, in which case the user must have pressed the submit button. If it has any other value, then we're going to consider that as being exit pressed. So if we try running our application now, and press the submit button, it will tell you submit was pressed. If we try it again, and hit exit, then it will tell you exit was pressed. So we're quite easily, with very little code, determining which button the user actually clicked. So as the purpose of our login form is to determine the username and password, we'll probably want to do something to confirm what the user keyed in. So let's go back to our callback function. So in here, we're into the section of code where the user has actually pressed the submit button. At this point, we want to pick up the username and password that the user has keyed on screen. So how would we do that? Well, there is a command which can quite happily pull information back from a text box. Control get text. Now this takes some parameters. The first is the handle of the dialog, which is this one here. This is a handle of the current dialog. Next it wants a handle for the control. Now the handle for the control for the username is this one. And I'm going to pass that to a variable called strUsername. Now we haven't declared this variable yet, but we'll do so in a moment. And we want to do exactly the same thing to pull back the value for the password. The only difference being is we will use the handle for the password. And we'll put that to a new variable called password. So let's create these 2 new variables at the beginning of our function. As we saw in the previous videos, we can declare these as locals. These are local to the callback function and only accessible within that function. So we're picking up the username and the password. So with any standard login form, you'll want to confirm these details. These may be confirmed against a database or against some encrypted data. So I'm going to create a little function whose job it is to return either true or false. It will return true if the username password combination is considered to be correct, and it will return false if it is not. And it will take two parameters, the first being the username, the second being the password. And we will create this small function further down our code. Starting with the word function, the name of our function, and the parameters it takes. Both of these are going to be strings, and it's going to return a long. So for the purposes of our demonstration here, we're going to assume that this username and password is correct, and we're going to return the value true. So if it's true, then the user password combination is correct. If it's false, then the user password combination is false. So how do we handle that for the next bit of the application? If the password is correct, we would want to complete the dialog and close it down, allowing return to the PB main function where we could move on to the next bit of code. So we'll take this line of code and we'll put that in here. If the user password is false, then we have a decision to make. Do we end the application immediately, or do we want the user to actually try again? If you put the cursor over the message box and hit the F1 button, you will then see the topics found, and the message box can either be a function or a statement. If we take it as a statement, we will see there are a number of options for a message box. We've at the moment only used just the text. Now the style in this case is we want to display it as an error. So we can put it in as icon error. And then the final parameter would be the title of a message box. We're just going to put it as invalid entry. So if we try compiling the code now, it compiles quite cleanly, and if we try running it, we will get our dialog coming up on screen. And if we hit submit, submit has been pressed, and this is coming from the PB main function. If we try running again, but this time we will change our function to return false. So regardless of what we key in here, it's going to reject our username and password, which it does, and it will allow us to type again. But each time it will reject it. So the final piece of work we want to do in the PB main function is to determine what comes back from our dialog. Now as we saw, the show dialog command will return a value. So let's create a local variable to capture that. And we're making the value of a long result equal to whatever comes back from our login dialog. So we're now testing the value coming back from our login dialog, and if it's okay, then the user password combination must be correct. If it's not, we're exiting the application. So since we're running show dialog as a function, it will run its parameter in brackets. If we try running this code now, and we hit submit, it'll say the password is not valid, which is fine. If we hit exit app, it will bring up exit pressed and exiting app. So if we change our function to allow us entry and change this to true and run our application again, hit submit, submit has been pressed, and we're now continuing with the app. We're now back into the PB main function. And in here you can put a call perhaps to another dialog or other parts of your code. One thing you will have noticed is there appear to be two PB main functions. one at the beginning of the application and one at the end. The one at the end is a copy of the code before we imported from the Forms Designer. Now we don't actually need this anymore, so we can quite happily remove this from our code to save any confusion. So in summary, you can see the PB Forms Designer can put together a dialog very quickly with the structure ready for you to enhance. So as we have one dialog in our application, how would we add a second dialog? Well, if we go back to the Forms Designer, we'll see it will default to loading up the first dialog. If we click on New, it would allow us to create a second dialog. And we're just quite simply going to create this with a system menu and caption to allow us to close it, just to show it on the screen. And we'll center it on the screen also. So if we save that, you'll see that on the select item has now got two dialogs. Login dialog and our second dialog. So let's give our second dialog a sensible name. We'll call that dialog continue, and we'll save that back to our application. Now we will see, if we look at the F2, that we have two entries for showing dialogs. There's the show dialog login and the show dialog continue. So in our PB main, where we had this line of code, if we put a call to our second dialog in here. So what this should do is it should display the first dialog to get the user to log in. If the user logs in successfully, then it will display the second dialog. So let's try running that code. We have our login to the system. We hit the submit button. Submit has been pressed, and our second dialog appears on the screen. And this allows us to click the X to exit out the application. However, before we finish up on this video, I'd like to show you the files that have been generated from this code. We started off with the formdemo.bas. Now PowerBasic will automatically create a backup of the last version of formdemo, but it's also created a number of other files. The executable file, which of course is our program. It has created a log file, which is the compilation details, and it has created 4 other files. It's created a form demo PBR, an RC file, a res file, and an XML file. It's important to mention these to ensure that you don't delete them by accident. The RC file is a resource file. This is a plain text file that is internally used by the Forms Designer, and it references this XML manifest file. And when you hit the compile button on your toolbar of the Windows compiler, it will generate both a res file and a PBR file. If we have a look at the beginning of our code, you'll see right at the top this resource file has been generated. It does this automatically, and normally you wouldn't have to touch this file. Each time you go into the Forms Designer and make a change to your code, then a new PBR would be automatically generated for you. But if you're backing up your application, it's important to back up all the files that are in the directory, including the PBR, the RC, and the res file. So in summary, you can see the PowerBasic Forms Designer can throw together multiple dialogues quite easily, giving you a structure that you can build on and put the plumbing in to expand out to the code of your application. This has been a short introduction to what we can do with forms. But that's it for today. Thank you for watching.